Hey, everybody. Happy Sunday. Just waiting for some people to log on for this week's Q&A session. So today we're going to be talking about any questions that you have for the AP Lang exam, because we are basically 2 months away at this point, which is still plenty of time, but it also feels like weirdly close. So we've got just a couple months to prepare. If you're new here, my name is Coach Hall. I'm an AP Lang teacher from Arkansas, and I go live every Sunday to answer student questions about the AP Lang exam. So if you happen to have any questions about AP Lang, like how to study, or if you want to know about like commentary or sophistication, feel free to leave any questions that you have about AP Lang in the chat. I'd be happy to answer those. So because the exam is coming up, I thought we could talk about some things that you could be doing to prepare in the next couple months. And as I'm talking, if you have questions about something, feel free to leave it in the chat. But right now, with 2 months out, there are some things that students can be doing in order to prepare. I think one thing that my students are doing right now is because we just had the ACT, which is our state test, we've been doing a lot of multiple choice practice. And that's one of the questions I get quite a lot is how can I practice for the multiple choice, especially if I don't have access to AP Classroom or things like that. So the good news is if you're studying for the ACT or SAT, you can actually use those questions to help you prepare for AP Lang as well. Specifically for the reading, you want to focus on the nonfiction passages. If you're doing the SAT, don't worry so much about the evidence questions. They don't have evidence questions on AP Lang, but focus on those nonfiction passages. And then for writing, either for ACT English or SAT Writing and Language, really focus on the questions that have a question stem. So questions that say something about like logical order or maybe transition words or adding and deleting sentences. That comes up quite a lot on the SAT, ACT, and AP Lang. So that's one thing that you could be doing if you're taking the AP Lang test is you want to make sure that you are practicing multiple choice. I like to have students practice for both AP and SAT or AP Lang. Or sorry, SAT or ACT. Something else that you could be doing right now as you're kind of preparing for the exam is broadening your knowledge. And I know that sounds kind of vague, but there's definitely something that you could be doing as far as like paying attention in history class. If you take APUSH, you're probably already learning about a lot of historical figures, historical movements, historical events in general. And that can be great evidence for the question 3, the argument essay for sure. So definitely be paying attention in your history classes, whether it's world or American history, because a lot of argument prompts can use historical evidence. I would also say if you have time, start paying attention to news articles, current events. A lot of times when students write about current events, it's kind of vague. Like, for instance, last year we might have seen some essays about like Ukraine, but people didn't really know specifics. So this year, depending on the prompt, of course, there could be a lot of topics that people talk about, like what's going on in Ohio or even stuff last summer with like Roe v. Wade and things like that. It really depends on the prompt, but you want to make sure you're informed about those topics and not just kind of like repeating what you think you've heard on social media. So I encourage my students to listen to podcasts. If you don't like to read, podcasts are a great option because if you're like me, you can kind of multitask. So you can listen to it while you're driving, as long as you're being safe, getting ready for school, things like that. Thank you for the likes on TikTok, by the way. So basically, podcasts are a great option. So are TED Talks if you're trying to get more knowledge for just your AP question 3, but also synthesis. We don't know what the topic's going to be, but sometimes people are able to bring in some outside knowledge of synthesis. My personal hope is that it's a topic that's super approachable because the past couple years they've done, like last year was STEM, which my students this year, when they wrote that prompt, they really didn't like it, but I feel like the topic of STEM is pretty approachable. And then 2 years ago, it was cursive writing. So we're kind of seeing a trend of like educational topics. So hopefully we'll continue to see some more like approachable topics as well. So if you're just joining, my name is Coach Hall. I'm an AP Lang teacher from Arkansas, and I make tutorial videos on YouTube and TikTok to help students prepare for the AP Lang exam. So if you're just joining, feel free to ask any questions that you have in the comments. I was just kind of going over some ways that you can kind of like low key start preparing, like light pressure, just practicing your multiple choice and preparing your world knowledge. Obviously, writing essays is going to help too, but I think a lot of people are doing that in class. How is your spring break going? Ours is actually next week. I'm really excited because, well, we're not doing anything cool, but I'm just excited to like have a week off. But yeah, we have in Arkansas, we have spring break in March. I grew up in Connecticut and our spring break was always in April. So definitely good for us to have a little break, I think. But we've got one more week before we have that. But I know some people in other states are already on spring break. So hopefully they're having a good break. What's a timeline? What should I do outside of class to prepare? So definitely be focusing on, I think it really depends on what you consider your strengths and weaknesses right now. So someone put in the chat like multiple choice. If multiple choice is a weakness, start using SAT and ACT tests to practice if you want some extra help. Not all the questions are going to correlate, but several will. Also, if you want like a full practice test that's not on AP Classroom, Marco Learning has one. If you go to their website, I think you just have to enter your email address, but they have a free practice test. And I've used that with some of my tutoring students with success. They felt like the questions were appropriate and stuff like that. So they have one. That's how I would focus on multiple choices, just like doing those practice tests. And then basically for like other stuff, if you are, a lot of students struggle with timing. So if your teacher hasn't had you do a lot of timed writes yet, where you haven't really had to look at a prompt and just write, that's something you can simulate at home just by finding a past exam and kind of writing. I've had a few students who are self-studying for the exam do that because I think timing is kind of a big issue for everybody. Does APUSH help with the AP Lang exam? Yes, I think it does. About half my students take APUSH with AP Lang. The other half are either in Gov or world history or like just a on-level US history. So I think it does. There's a few things to like remember though, is like a DBQ in APUSH is sort of like a synthesis paper, but like there are different expectations. But as far as like integrating your evidence and incorporating sources, there are plenty of similarities. My understanding is APUSH, they want you to use all the sources, and in synthesis, it's at least 3. Most students do 3 or 4. And then obviously the objectives are different because APUSH, it's a history class. But once I think students realize the difference in expectations, I think synthesis does help. Like they kind of go hand in hand, like, and there's overlap there. And then some of my favorite argument essays to read are when students use historical evidence. I can kind of tell what my students have learned in APUSH or what they're working on because they try to tie it into the argument prompts that we do. So that can be really helpful because there's certain historical figures and dates and events and things that you probably have to remember for APUSH. And so hypothetically, they could fit an argument prompt. It just kind of depends. So I do think they help. Like if you're taking APUSH and you're studying for APUSH, then you sort of are helping yourself for AP Lang, especially since I think the APUSH test, I'm pretty sure is first because AP Lang's in week 2. So all that studying you're doing for APUSH, maybe, just maybe you'll be able to use it for your argument essay or something. At least I hope so. Let's see. How do I bring in my own evidence for synthesis? So you can bring it in as commentary. And for some of the recent prompts that have kind of dealt with like school topics, I have seen students incorporate that well. So for instance, a couple years ago on the exam, there was like a worksheet basically for cursive writing. And so I had some students who were trying to talk about like how tedious cursive writing is and how boring it is. And so they mentioned the worksheet and they kind of brought up their own personal experience about it. And then it was funny because I'd read an essay where kids were like, oh, it was so boring and blah, blah, blah. And like, they were talking about how it's like outdated and we don't need cursive. And these worksheets were not helpful. And then I'd read like the next essay and somebody would be like, I loved this. Like I loved tracing all these letters in cursive. So you can do it that way. With STEM, I didn't see as many students working in personal connections, but I felt like that was almost a missed opportunity at times. It just kind of depends, but you remember that it's commentary. So we want to make sure that we're not bringing up personal experience and synthesis unless it's actually relevant to what we're saying. You could also bring it up in your conclusion. I did read one essay from one of my students where they are a female who wants to go into a STEM field. So they brought it up in their conclusion, how they're a female wanting to go into STEM. And this is why their argument was that STEM and the humanities are important and we need a balance. And so they kind of talked about why. So they made it more personal at the end. which worked really well for that particular essay. But yeah, a lot of people bring up personal experience and argument too. Houston, Texas is on spring break. That's nice. Hopefully, y'all have good weather. It's gotten really cold here in Arkansas. AP Lang is on May 9th. Okay, hold on. I think it's May 10th. Let me look. I don't know if I have my calendar, but AP Lang exam. Let me see. I'm pretty sure it's May 10th. If anybody knows for sure, you want to just type it in the comments. That would be helpful. But now that I'm saying that, I'm questioning myself. Let's see. May 10th. Nope, that's a Wednesday. It's May 9th. Sorry. It's May 9th in the morning. You were right. For some reason, in my mind, May 10th was the Tuesday. Also, it used to be on Wednesdays. And then like last year, they moved it to a Tuesday, which is not that bad. But last year, my students, after the exam, we did like Taco Tuesday. I think we're going to do that this year too. I don't have too many students though. I have like somewhat small numbers. So it's like a little bit easier for me to buy them tacos. If I had like 150 AP Lang students, that would be a little harder. But yes, you are correct. It is May 9th. I apologize for saying the wrong date. In my mind, it was the 10th that was a Tuesday. All right, let me get to some more questions over here on TikTok. And also, if you're watching on YouTube, we'll answer some there as well. So we got a question on YouTube. Do you have videos on how to improve on the MCQs? Yes, I do. The only downside to my videos about MCQs is because of copyright, I can't show questions very well without possibly risking like copyright issues, which I obviously don't want to do. So a lot of them are tips. They're like, okay, here are things to look for. And so I think I have a multiple choice question playlist. If I don't, I'll definitely make one. But I have a lot of tips for like the writing questions, and also some tips on the reading questions. But unfortunately, like I wish I could just put a test up there and be like, hey, here's how we answer this. But I don't feel comfortable writing my own test questions for multiple choice. And even though the test, some of the stuff for like SAT is publicly available, I just think it's still copyrighted. So I don't want to do that. But yes, I do have like general tips videos for sure. Am I on food stamps? No. Don't know how that's really relevant, but thank you for asking, I guess. You've asked it twice in the chat. No, I'm not. I make a comfortable living. I have a lot of students who are in dire need of help. So I use whatever extra money I can to help them. I have like a little pantry in my classroom, but I personally am not. But there's no shame for those that are. Are you an AP reader? Yes, I've been an AP reader this is about to be my third year. And then I've done our state mock exam for about probably 6 or 7 years, which is kind of different. In Arkansas, we have like, it's not all schools, but maybe probably like 20 or 30 schools participate. And we basically send teachers to a hotel conference room and we like grade each other's essays and everybody writes the same essays. So that has been really helpful as well as far as like reading it. But yes, I was an AP reader. My first year was online and I did rhetorical analysis. And then last year was kind of a weird situation that I really hope doesn't happen again. We're in Tampa, which I like. I know there's controversy with Florida, but the location was nice. And it was great to see everybody in person. But what happened was there were issues scanning the test. Like nothing got lost or anything. There was just like a delay. And so they trained us. Normally you read one essay the whole time. So whoever reads your question one essay, they're only typically, with the exception of last year, they only read question one, which is helpful because then you get to be an expert on it. And then there's another portion of people who do Q2, Q3. So that way there's no way one person's grading all 3 of your essays on the exam. So anyway, last year we all started with whatever we were. And I started with rhetorical analysis again. Which I was super excited about. But then because there was like a delay and they knew that we might have to read at home after the reading was over, they trained us on the other 2 essays. And so I was trained on all 3 and I scored for all 3. But it was kind of weird last year and I'm hoping that doesn't happen again. But that had like nobody's scores were affected. Everybody went through the proper training and all that. I want to be very clear about that. So it was helpful because I got to try all 3 essays. But as a first-time person being in person for the live reading and not being an online reader, it felt like I would have preferred to just, I think, stick with one, like the expected experience. And unfortunately, we don't get to pick which essay we read. They're just randomly assigned. So the fact that I got rhetorical analysis for 2 years, I don't know what I'll get this year, but RA is my favorite. Yes, they grade the exams during the summer. It's for us, it's like June. I think AP Lit's the week before us. And I think last year they were in like Salt Lake City or something. But each like subject has its own location where they go. And there are some on-site readers and then there's some online readers. And we all go through the same training and things like that. And there's different like checks involved to make sure that people are being accurate. But they score them in June and then tests are like the scores are released in July. What is line of reasoning? It's a logical progression of ideas. So a writer is going to have a line of reasoning. If you are looking at rhetorical analysis, you want to figure out their structure and like how they're presenting their ideas, because they're going to be making choices in a certain order in order to be effective. And then you as a student have to have a line of reasoning, which basically means that you want to make your evidence be in a logical order. You want your body paragraphs to prove your thesis. Transition words help with a line of reasoning. So it's basically like making sure you prove your point and you're logical. So has a lot to do with like structure. But for an essay, just make sure that you have a clear thesis, that you have clear main ideas and evidence and commentary that is actually supporting those main ideas. And that helps as well. Honestly, you have opened my mind to see how to write better in my AP Lang exam. Well, that's good. There's definitely different ways to improve your writing style, even if you're not going for sophistication. I just posted a sophistication video, but the thing about sophistication is I tell my students a lot, like, hey, here are some things that you can do to help with your sophistication. And you may or may not earn the points, but it at least helps with your writing style. So things like adding in precise adjectives or adverbs, that can really help. So like instead of saying he claims, well, how is he claiming it? Is he boldly claiming it? Is he, I don't know, logically asserting something? Like we want to try to use adverbs and adjectives to help. Also, getting rid of lower level words really helps because it's hard to do this as you're writing, but we tend to use words like good and bad, even hard instead of difficult. So there's usually certain words that we can take out and just kind of use a stronger synonym for. And that's not going to get you the sophistication point, but it at least helps the quality of your essay. If you're working on your writing style, definitely try to learn how to use colons, dashes, and semicolons correctly. I feel like dashes and colons, when used appropriately, really helps your writing. Semicolons are just nice when people actually use them correctly, but they're like not as impactful in the reading experience, if I like, just in my opinion. But if I have videos on YouTube about that, they're pretty quick videos about like how to use colons and how to use dashes. Don't overdo it. Like we do not need 2 or 3 per paragraph, but if you're using them effectively, it can really help. Should I take AP Lang or a college accredited writing class? It kind of depends on your strengths and what's happening at your school. Because I know a lot of schools do, like my school does AP Lang for juniors and then AP Lit for seniors, and juniors can also take college English, which is separate. So it's not an AP class, but it is concurrent credit. The town where I live is not the town where I teach, but they do AP Lang as a concurrent credit class. So they get like 3 college credits for taking the class, regardless of their AP Lang score. And then so some people have it as a separate class. Some people, you get both in like dual enrollment. I would ask yourself a couple things. What are your goals? So like, do you consider yourself a strong writer? Or are you just trying to get the college credit? Like, do you want the guaranteed credit, or do you want to challenge yourself a little bit more? Because I think depending on the environment at your school, that might change. I would also talk to people who are currently in those classes at your school and ask them their opinion. Because, maybe one teacher is super awesome, or maybe they're like, yeah, this is a lot of work. Do the other class instead. I don't know what it is, but like basically try to make an informed decision with your school. I personally feel like at my school, AP Lang is harder than the college English class that I also teach. And I can say that because I teach both. And so a lot of my students take AP Lang, and even if they get a qualifying score, they take college English because they don't want to go into lit. They can take 1 semester of college English and they get their high school credit too. and then they get a semester off. And this year, that's what a lot of them wanted. They were like, we just don't want to have to be in school because they're allowed to do half days now. So it had nothing to do with like anything against the AP Lit teacher. They just literally just didn't want to come to school as much, which I kind of can't blame them. So I think both have value. They amount to the same thing because if you get college credit for AP Lang, it's usually for Comp 1 or Comp 2. Or sorry, well, okay, I know one college where if you get a 5, it gets you more than 3 credits, but it's Comp 2 is usually AP Lit, but it's College English 1 or Comp 1. They call it different things. Were there AP exams during COVID? There were. The COVID year was actually kind of one of my favorite years for some reason, just because like my students worked so hard from home. And like, that was really when I feel like my YouTube channel took off as well. Cause I already had a channel. So I was already helping my students online. And then like, there were a lot of students wanting like help and support. And that year, because of COVID, so in 2020, it was just one essay. It was rhetorical analysis. So they had like 45 minutes to write. And they had like, there were multiple testing dates because of a variety of reasons, but total, there were like 28 prompts. So there were a lot of prompts that year. Like within my students who all took it on the same day, I think we had, because they actually let us see the essays. Normally you have to like ask to have them sent back to you and you have to pay. And like, we don't normally see our students' essays. And even if we do, we don't know the score they got. But that year it was kind of easy to figure out. When we knew their qualifying score, it was kind of easy to figure out how it would have scored on the rubric because there's just one essay. But also we got to see their essays that year. And so I probably had like 6 or 7 prompts among my students. A couple of them were historical, a lot of speeches and letters. I think one group it was like a foreword to a book, and they did not like that one because they said it was a lot harder to write about. So I'm just trying to scroll up for the questions to see if I missed any. Someone asked for tips for rhetorical analysis essays. So basically, for rhetorical analysis, the best advice I could give you is to make sure that you are integrating the rhetorical situation. So a lot of students will just write like soapstone or space cat on their paper, and they'll like figure out who the speaker is, but like they won't actually think about who the speaker is. So for instance, we need to remember that the speaker is going to tailor their message to their audience. So like last year on the exam, the speaker was Sonia Sotomayor. At the time, she was an appeals court judge. She was speaking at a like law school, UC Berkeley School of Law. So she was speaking to lawyers or like future lawyers. They were like law students. So we have someone who in the future became the first Latina Supreme Court justice. She wasn't at the time of the speech, but she was speaking to law students. So perhaps they're going to look up to her. She also mentions in the speech that she's Latina. She calls herself a New York Rican because she's from New York, and she's also Puerto Rican. And the speech is all about her identity. So students who actually like figured out, okay, she's a judge speaking to law students, and she's going to be advising them and like thinking about why that matters, those tended to be stronger essays. So really think about the speaker audience connection. For some of the passages, there's going to be a historical connection too. So you want to really be thinking about why are they making these choices for this audience on this occasion? Because a lot of times what happens with these lower scoring essays is they might just say something like, she makes this comparison to open the reader's eyes. Well, that doesn't really tell us anything. Like that's a very empty expression. So to open their eyes about what? Like, can we say that more precisely? Like, what does she really want them to think about? And why does she want them to think about it? So that's going to be the best way to get your commentary up in rhetorical analysis is really explaining why and adding multiple sentences of the why. So use words like because or in order to actually be able to analyze why they're doing what they're doing, but really think about who their audience is. Because if you think about it, let's say you're talking to your parents or guardians, you're probably going to talk to them in a different way than you talk to maybe a teacher. You're definitely probably going to talk to them in a different way than you talk to your friends. So you're making different choices based on who your audience is. So writers do that too. All right, let's see. We got a quick question over here on YouTube. Is line of reasoning a claim? Okay, so it kind of is because you do have to have Like your thesis is your overarching claim. The thesis is the central argument of your paper. And so if we think of that as the main claim, each body paragraph is going to have main ideas, which are kind of like subclaims. So the body paragraphs have to prove your thesis. And that actually sounds really easy and really obvious, but it's not always the case. In lower scoring essays, that's where things tend to fall apart, is they're not fully proving their thesis. So for instance, in rhetorical analysis, this is another tip for that, is they're going to ask you about message, argument, or purpose. And so whichever one they ask you about, make sure that you put that in your thesis. So your thesis, we want choices for sure. And then remember, our rhetorical choice is what the writer is doing. And then we want their message, argument, or purpose. And we want to be specific. If you just say to convey their message, you haven't really told us anything. But then in your body paragraphs, you need to talk about how whichever choice you're analyzing helps them convey their message, and tell us what the message is. Tell us why the message is relevant to their audience, or why the message is important at that point in history. That's going to develop your commentary, and it's going to create that line of reasoning. A lot of students who tend to score a little bit lower on rhetorical analysis don't actually really think about the purpose, message, or argument, or if they do, it's really repetitive and simplistic. So that would be another tip for rhetorical analysis to help your line of reasoning, is make sure you're actually explaining how what they're doing helps their message, argument, or purpose. And try to do that in both paragraphs as well. A weird little tip for rhetorical analysis, and this kind of applies to all the essays, is you can have one awesome paragraph that does its job, and the other paragraph could be so-so, like it could be close, but not quite there. You could still earn a 130. So for those that are struggling with pacing, really focus on getting at least one solid paragraph, ideally two. Conclusions are nice, but they're not mandatory. There are so many times when I've seen students write essays where they tried for like 3 body paragraphs, and it was just like a weaker line of reasoning. It was very underdeveloped. And I couldn't help but think, like, if they had just done 2 body paragraphs instead, like, would that have helped? Like, if they had used that time to develop 2 ideas instead of 3, would that have changed their score? And like, I kind of assume in a lot of cases, the answer is yes. Let's see. Honestly, I'm not a good writer. Okay, that's fair. But my teacher helped me catch on really fast. Okay, so yeah, definitely talk to like your teacher as well. If you're trying to figure out like what classes. I've seen students improve a lot from like August, which is when we start school, to May. I've seen students, like, because I teach 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. Some of my 10th graders, like when they start versus like where they are as juniors in AP Lang, like it's night and day. So just because you're like, if you think you're a bad writer, that doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't take the class. One of my top students in terms of work ethic, like one of the hardest working students I've ever had, she didn't necessarily make the score that we wanted her to make on the exam, but the person that she started as in terms of being like a writer versus like in the beginning of her junior year versus May, it was a night and day difference. And she is now in college. She is now one of the top softball players in the SEC. Like, she's killing it. And I'm so proud of her because she put the hard work in. And there were times when she was like, I am not a good writer. But here's the thing. She was a student of writing. Like, she learned what to do. And so I think like students who say, oh, I'm not a good writer, that's okay, because you can learn that. If you're willing to learn, you can learn how to be a stronger writer. And also, like, writing is kind of personal too. Like, there's different styles. So there's not one way to write a good essay, which is helpful for the exam for sure. Could you do a thesis and the rhetorical devices right in the introductory plus the message? I think so. Okay, let me make sure I'm understanding your question. So in your intro, you can have a sentence or two to set up the essay, and a thesis, and your thesis should ideally have rhetorical choices. That's what the rubric says, but a lot of teachers want to see message, argument, or purpose as well. It just really helps. So I have a formula that I have my students use, and they can break the formula if they want to, but it kind of helps them. So they just say something like, in so-and-so's speech to whatever audience or at whatever event, and then he or she does, and then choice 1, choice 2. So we want to focus on strong verbs there. in order to, and then they say the message, argument, or purpose. There's other ways to, like, that is like the simplest one, but there's other ways to update that as well. So that would be your thesis. And then your body paragraphs. So let's say the first choice I want to talk about is that they compare something. So then in the body paragraph, if I want to talk about comparison, then that would be in my topic sentence. So that's your claim, your main idea. And then I would need evidence of the comparison. And I'd really want to like look at the word choice used. And so my commentary would be explaining my evidence. And we want more commentary than evidence. And then ideally, to fully develop my paragraph, I would try to have another layer of evidence and commentary. So you can take quotes and kind of break them up. You can analyze the word choice that the speaker is using within those quotes. You can talk about tone. You really want to talk about like why they're doing it. So that would be like the general structure of it. What would you recommend a person do if they have not been reading books? Like Animal Farm and such. Okay, so the good news is that you really don't have to have read a lot of books for AP Lang. On AP Lit, yes. Because in AP Lit, they have their question 3, which is like a larger works question. And it's usually like you can write about a play or a novel, things like that. Apparently kids write about like TV shows and movies and stuff too, but that's kind of frowned upon in a lot of cases. So for AP Lang, like if you have not been reading a lot, that's okay, because the emphasis is really on nonfiction. So while you can write about fiction, you don't have to. I would say focus on just kind of broadening your historical knowledge and current events, and maybe reading a nonfiction book or two. That might help. Do you recommend doing 2 or 3 rhetorical devices? For rhetorical choices, I would say most of my students do 2, if I'm being honest. It kind of depends on the passage, what you think you can accomplish in 40 minutes. It would be better to do 2 really good paragraphs than 3 mediocre ones. We want like quality paragraphs. Okay, so I'm just scrolling back just to see if I missed anything. Someone said AP is a scam. I understand that some people like don't like it, but I don't think AP itself is a scam. At least not in my experience. AP is a means for some of my students to get college credit where they ordinarily wouldn't. And in Arkansas, students can take an AP test for free. A couple states do that. So for my students who tend to get 3s, 4s, and 5s, it's not a scam at all. For other people, yes, I could see how it could be frustrating. And I don't think it's a perfect system, but I don't think it's a scam. What are your qualifications? I am a 3-year AP reader. I am a leader for our state mock exam. I am a table leader for our state mock exam, and I've been teaching for 9 years. And then before that, I taught in South Africa on a Fulbright grant for a year. And I happen to have one of the top 2 YouTube channels for AP Lang, and I am internationally known for my videos. There's this one person in the comments who's getting a little bit snarky. Let's see, what other questions do we have? If you asked one and I skipped it, feel free to just repost it. Let's see. What does a 140 look like? So basically a 140, pretty much on all essays, but especially for rhetorical analysis, is going to be obviously your thesis. And then you're going to have all claims supported evenly and thoroughly with evidence and commentary. So because of that, like a 1-3, there's usually like one paragraph that's really elevating the quality of the essay. And maybe the others are like so-so, like they're close, but not quite. Maybe they just like lack a little bit of consistency or insight. So, but there's that like one paragraph, whereas a 1-4 is going to be very consistent. It might not be sophisticated, because that's a separate qualification. That's row C. But if we look at your paragraphs, they're going to be very even. So they're going to be very strong with the evidence and commentary connecting to the rhetorical situation for rhetorical analysis. And they're even. So even though they're basically like, there's not going to be like a weak paragraph. It's going to be that they're both equally as strong. Or if there's 3, that all 3 are equally strong. General tips on commentary. Remember that commentary is the why. So you want to make sure that your commentary is actually explaining the significance of your evidence. So, like, why is what you said important? Why does it matter? And for commentary, like little quick tips, the word because can help because it gets you to the why. Sometimes in order to helps. Um, Verbs like highlights, illustrates, suggests. Suggest is kind of like weaker, but it works. Trying to think, emphasizes or underscores. Underscores means emphasizes. Those words can help you kind of signal your commentary as well. So those are some general tips for commentary. For rhetorical analysis, we kind of already talked about it, but just making sure that you're explaining why they're making that choice for that audience on that occasion. I do have several YouTube videos about commentary. For rhetorical analysis, I have one that's called like my best tip for rhetorical analysis essays, and it deals with how to actually write your commentary and connect to the rhetorical situation. So I definitely recommend that one. For synthesis and argument, your commentary is going to look a little bit different because you're not trying to connect it to a rhetorical situation. But for those, it's more about like analyzing the significance of your evidence. So if you're giving us an example, what does your example show? Just try not to use the word show. Try to use something a little stronger, like highlight or illustrate, convey, demonstrate. But like, what's the meaning behind it or the lesson? We also want to think about like the short-term and long-term impact. So a lot of times for synthesis, they'll give you concrete data like facts, statistics, and examples. And so if you're incorporating those things to make a very logical argument, that's great. But like, why does it matter? So if you're pulling a fact that says like wind energy is 1,164 times more efficient than coal, okay, that's great. But why does that matter to your argument? So if you're, that kind of thing. So we want to talk about why it matters. And we really want to think about short term, long term. For synthesis, usually connect it to society. Like, how is this going to help or harm society? And for argument, since you get to choose your examples, there's pros and cons to that because sometimes it's kind of tricky. But on the other hand, because you choose your examples, you hopefully can explain their significance quite well. How do I stop writing generally in my argument essay? That's a great question. So I'm assuming you're talking about your evidence, but you could also be talking about commentary. So for evidence, let's start there because you have to have specific evidence in order to be eligible for a 3 or a 4. Like, we don't want that somewhat specific evidence. We want it to be specific. So with specific evidence, we're going to be seeing, first of all, proper nouns. So specific people, places, if that's relevant. We want concrete because if you are talking about like war, that's very general. But if you're talking about like World War II, okay, now we have a proper noun. Still kind of vague though. So could you like break that down even more? So could you talk about a specific person, a specific event, things like that? So we want to have specific categories and like specific people, events, things like that, not just something general. Like sports is general, but like Simone Biles, that's much more specific. So that's where I would start with your evidence, is making sure that it's specific. Usually you're going to want to give like 2 or 3 sentences, depending on what it is, to explain it. Don't assume your reader knows who it is. So even if it's somebody really popular, like Simone Biles, or maybe it's a historical figure like Abraham Lincoln or Rosa Parks, like, still tell us who they are. You can be very concise with it. Like, for instance, you could say Simone Biles, comma, 2-time Olympian, comma, or like Simone Biles, comma, the world's greatest gymnast, comma. Like, you can give us like a little hint as to like who they are without giving us a boring sentence, but you do want to make sure that you're clarifying who the person is. And you want to tell us whatever concrete details you have. Try not to make up stuff though. Like, try not to make up dates or accomplishments. So I do know that sometimes students make up like personal experience and stuff, and like they're not going to fact check you. But try to make sure that what you're talking about is something that you can write about knowledgeably. If you can't remember an exact date, give a time period. That's fine. Like, I've seen students write like approximately 2014. That's fine. Like, you're trying. So that's going to be your evidence. And then your commentary, to make it, not vague, basically. You want to explain why your example matters and more specifically how it relates to the topic at hand. So if your topic is striving for perfection, what does this particular example teach us about that? Why does this matter? So kind of think about like the lesson or the takeaway from that. All right, let's see what else we've got. How do I get 4 points for evidence and commentary instead of three? So basically, you're going to have to um, make sure that your paragraphs are consistent. So if you happen to have an old essay that you wrote that was like a 130, chances are there's going to be one paragraph that was maybe weaker than the others. And so we want to try to identify where that dip is. Like, are you not proving all your claims thoroughly? Like, do you have evidence that kind of goes unexplained? Like, is there a part of your commentary that's weaker? Because chances are that's probably why it would be the 1-3 and not the 1-4. But the key to a 1-4 is being very thorough and evenly explaining things, which is why we want to see that you have a clear topic for each paragraph, specific evidence, and then plenty of commentary for it. Could you do a Google Classroom where we write an RA and you would grade them? I don't do that in general. I do offer tutoring services, but because I have my own full teaching load and I'm also a mom, I don't just grade essays for free. But I do offer tutoring and I tutor on OutSchool. There's a link in my profile. If you sign up for OutSchool and you're brand new, they give you $20 off your first class. I have a $20 class, so it's technically free for you. But I still technically get paid from OutSchool. But I can't just grade other students' work because I don't have a ton of time. But if you are interested in tutoring, I do offer those services on OutSchool. So I do one-on-one tutoring, and I also offer some like group classes as well. I'm sure it's complex, but how do I get the sophistication point? I can't ever get it. Yeah, it's super hard. I actually just posted a video about some tips for sophistication with rhetorical analysis. I posted it late last night. So please go check out that video on YouTube and give it some love. It kind of depends on which essay we're talking about, but I think in general, the easiest way to do it is that broader context. For rhetorical analysis, really analyzing the rhetorical situation. At the AP conference I was just at last week for our state, we kind of talked about how with the data that we have, it seems like that's the easiest way for students to get it. The hardest way seems to be vivid and descriptive style. So unless you like love creative writing and you have your own unique voice, I feel like that's the one where students can improve their style. I can give plenty of tips on how to improve your style, but to actually earn it for style is probably the most rare. And then with rhetorical analysis, the middle one, like the one that's like maybe easy for some prompts and not others, is analyzing the complexities and tensions. I feel like some prompts really lend itself to that because like there's maybe tension with like audience and speaker, or there's like historical complexity or tension. But I think that one's kind of the middle because it doesn't, in my opinion, it doesn't equally apply to all prompts. Like not every student is going to be able to do that the same for all prompts. So those are my tips for that. And those are all in that video that I mentioned. And then for synthesis and argument, a lot of people try to go for the sophistication point by putting in a counterclaim and rebuttal, but just doing that alone does not automatically make it nuanced. So we see a lot of people possibly trying for it that way. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I know that there are students out there who are told like, hey, just make sure you put one in there. It helps your argument. But in actuality, don't put in a counterclaim and rebuttal unless it truly helps your argument. Like if it's not convincing, then just focus on your other main ideas. Just my opinion. Okay, so we have a question on YouTube. Are there any tips for writing under 40 minutes? Yes. So here's the thing about the exam is you get 2 hours and 15 minutes total for your 3 FRQs, your 3 essays. So what they're going to do is they're going to tell you if you're taking it like in person. I'm assuming if it's digital, there's like a little timer and stuff. But they're going to tell you your time has begun, and that's your recommended 15-minute reading period. I tell my students to try to read synthesis and plan their essay in 10 minutes because most of my students need about 45 minutes for rhetorical analysis. So I tell them to kind of bank those 5 minutes because they're going to verbally prompt you on like what you like should be doing, but you can use the time however you want. So most students start with synthesis because it's the most time consuming, it's the most involved, because you have to read the sources. I would recommend for synthesis, if you're trying to save time, to they tell you to try to come up with your argument before you actually read the sources. I've seen that work really well, but I've also seen it really flop. Um, and if the topic is something you don't know, just go straight to the sources. But if you know you're not going to use a source, do not bother reading and annotating it, because that's just a waste of your time. Like if you're like, no, definitely not using this, don't bother. I would say if a source is really long and you might consider yourself a slow reader, don't shy away from a long source, because honestly, a lot of the times the long sources are super helpful. So read the first paragraph and then maybe look at the topic sentences to see what it's about and if it could be helpful. That would at least give you the gist of it without you having to read the whole thing. And again, that's if you're pressed for time or if you're just like struggling for other reasons. Like let's be honest, like these tests involve a lot of like feelings and anxiety. So that is a quick way to skim in a meaningful way. With synthesis, I think it's helpful for students to plan out their thesis and their main ideas. You don't have to write the full thesis, but I would at least be clear on what your position is and what your main ideas are. And I would even probably go so far as to put down like which sources you intend to use, like maybe make some kind of like list or T-chart or something. I think if you make some kind of chart or something as you annotate, people annotate differently, but that can really help. So like you don't need a ton of notes, but make sure your notes are meaningful. So some of my students, depending on the topic and like what they're being asked to do, they might make like some kind of chart on like their cover page. Other students put like the main idea of the source up at the top in the corner so that they know. But there's ways to kind of streamline your annotations. That way you're not flipping through your booklet going like, wait, which source said this? So that can be really helpful. So find a system that works for you. But I would definitely say know which sources you're going to use before you start writing. That way you can just make sure that you're using 3, because we want to make sure that you have 3 sources. For rhetorical analysis, same kind of concept. I would take the time to actually read the prompt. And I tell my students, like put an S above the speaker if you want to, things like that. And like really underline what the task is. Like, what are you actually being told to write about? Because for rhetorical analysis, it's going to be choices and then message, argument, or purpose, but we got to know what they're actually asking. They don't give you a lot of space for rhetorical analysis to annotate. Like the columns are really narrow, like the margins. So I would say if you're going to like underline or circle things, make sure it's something that you are going to possibly use as evidence. I write like shorthand in the margins if I can. So that way I can write like kind of like anything that I think is significant. So sometimes less is more, but if you're reading something and you're like, oh, they're doing this and here's why, put the why in your notes too, because you don't want to forget that. How do you identify shifts in an RA passage? Look for a shift in topic, choice, or tone. Not all passages technically have a shift, but if there is one, it's probably going to be because of topic, choice, or tone. And so to save time for rhetorical analysis, I think that all 3 essays, one thing to keep in mind is we need short intros, 1 or 2 sentences plus a thesis if possible. Worst case scenario, just a thesis. I tend to like to have like a sentence or 2 before it, so you're not just like, boom, here's my thesis. But worst case scenario, just write your thesis. And then 2 body paragraphs if possible. Some students do 3. My students pretty much always do 2, and they score very well. I think part of it is because I teach them quality over quantity. But there are some prompts that kind of lend themselves to 3 paragraphs. Conclusions are not needed. They are nice, but they're not needed. So if you are struggling with pacing, and like the conclusion is usually the first thing to go. There's nothing on the rubric that says you need one. And the other thing is like, yes, obviously try to write in neat penmanship, but like, we know that you're writing as quickly as you can. And so like, we can read it. Don't worry about spelling. Don't worry about grammar. You can go back in and like add a little arrow and write something, or write in the margin as long as it's like on the page. I've even seen people go to like the end of their essay and write stuff and kind of draw arrows or use little stars or asterisks. So as long as we can read your essay, it's good. But like, don't try to like be a perfectionist writer as you go. Like if you misspell a word, it is okay. I promise. So question here on YouTube for students asking to do a full length practice, besides referring them to online practice tests, is there anything you do in class to simulate the full test? That's a really great question. So my school does 3 after school study sessions. We're required to. So I have one in November. We just had one in February. We do another one in May. I know not everybody's in a position to do that, but I know a lot of teachers do some kind of like mock exam. And that's how I do it because our classes are 45 minutes. So it's really hard to do a synthesis cold read in 45 minutes because there's not enough time. And it's definitely hard to do multiple choice in 45 minutes because they really should have the hour. So I do have some students who kind of time themselves on their own outside of class, and that's okay. One of the things that we do a lot in class is throughout the year is like I might have them spend like 5 minutes to write an intro, or I might say you have 20 minutes to write a body paragraph. And then as they get better at it, I might say, okay, now try to do it in like 17 minutes or 15 minutes. And my students in the past have said that that really helps because even though we did some full essays for sure, don't get me wrong, but like what made the full essays easier was like those little timed not experiments but like timed situations because they kind of got this internal clock to know how things were. So I do think students should hopefully be able to write like a full exam at one point. Like a mock exam is super helpful, but I know not everybody can. But yes, there are the online tests, but even if you do in class, like let's say you can't get your students for like 3 hours, or let's say you are a student and you can't spend 3 hours on this, at least practice like an individual essay timed. And I would try to do a couple per essay. What I did last year with my students that I intend to do this year too is like when it got closer to the exam, one week they wrote one essay. We didn't touch it. They wrote it. The next week they wrote another one, another cold read, or maybe we prepped for them. It just kind of depended. And then at the end, they had 2 essays that they had written, and then they got to decide this is the one I'm giving to Coach Hall to score, and then this is the one that we're going to peer edit. So they got feedback on both, but I only had to score one, and they had the choice too. So they got to say like, yeah, this one's better. This is the one that I want a grade for, and that really helped as well. So they were getting more practice, but as a teacher, I didn't have to score as much. And they peer edit very well. I find rhetorical analysis very difficult and struggle with the introduction and sophistication. Any tips? For the intro, try not to, the intro does not have to be super complex. Make sure it's clear what the rhetorical situation is. So kind of lead into it that way. And then make sure you have a clear thesis. I just did a video on my YouTube channel. I posted it pretty late last night, all about sophistication for rhetorical analysis and how you can earn it and just some general tips. So definitely go check out that video because in that video, I talk about how to really analyze the rhetorical situation, which is usually the way if students earn the sophistication point for rhetorical analysis, most of the time it's because of that. Or they're looking at tension and complexity. So they're looking at like speaker audience complexity or maybe time period complexity if it's a historical passage. The way that we see it happen the least, in my opinion, is the vivid and descriptive writing style. So I do have tips for that, like incorporate basically like adverbs, adjectives, stronger word choice, eliminate lower level word choice, incorporate advanced punctuation like dashes and colons. You can even make your own rhetorical choices, but I feel like that's super hard. The students that have done that well for me are my ones that are already really super into creative writing. So they can like use repetition in a meaningful way and it just happens naturally for them. Most of my students are like, yep, nope, not trying that. So the vivid and descriptive style is the one that I see the sophistication point for the least, but it does still happen. So if you want like more in-depth tips for sophistication, definitely go to my YouTube channel and check out that video. And I also have a video about intros. So if you're like, yeah, I want to try for a fancier intro, I don't just want like a sentence or two in a thesis, I want it to be more meaningful, just type in Coach Hall writes rhetorical analysis intro. And I do have a video that kind of breaks down different techniques for you. So I have my students kind of play around with these techniques as sophomores. And then like, honestly, as juniors, most of them just kind of like, because of the timing, they just kind of go for a very straightforward intro, but some of them still use those techniques as well. I think when you have 40 minutes on the clock, like a lot of things that you might want to do go out the window. Like you just focus on your points and trying to get as many points as you can. At least that's what they tell me. And I don't blame them. Um, do you have any writing tips for an argument essay if you haven't read any books? Are movies okay? They are. I mean, here's my personal opinion, and I don't speak for all readers when I say this. I prefer historical evidence and current events if you can write about them well. Um, but and then you can write about personal experience. And I don't mind when students write about pop culture at all. I feel like you have to choose what's going to be best for you. Like I have a couple students right now who they could give me an amazing pop culture essay. But if I had them write about history, it would just not be as strong. And so I tell them play to their strengths because like if you can give me the specifics and the analysis about it, then great. Movies are kind of a gray area because I have had students do it well, but usually there's some kind of like historical example or current event that they maybe could have written about instead. But on the exam, it doesn't really matter like what your reader wants you to write about. They are supposed to be unbiased. We just kind of evaluate what's on the page. So if you get a prompt and all you can think about is some kind of pop culture example or a movie or something, just make sure you're following the criteria on the rubric. Make sure that it is specific and that you have developed commentary. Because I would much rather have you write about something that you're very knowledgeable about and then develop that like credibility with your voice as opposed to something where it's clear that you're just trying to like remember something from like history class 3 years ago. Just my personal opinion. But yeah, I've had students write about movies and they were okay. One time last year, like I had a group of students who they got to like work together and like brainstorm right before they wrote. And for whatever reason, it was the Exploring the Unknown prompt. And all they could come up with was like Tangled and Moana. And honestly, for writing about 2 Disney movies, these essays were solid. But after they turned them in, I was like, hey, like let's talk about some other things we could have written about. And so like we looked at what their commentary was, and then I started kind of having them think about what like personal experience because I happen to know these kids and their siblings, and so it's like, okay, you talked about how like Rapunzel had to leave her castle in Tangled. What about when your siblings just went away to college a couple years ago? Like, could we talk about that instead? Or like connect it to that. So they wrote about it really well. But I tried to use it as a teaching moment of like, if we can't think of anything besides Disney, how do we branch out? What about biblical stories? You can. It's kind of a touchy subject. Um, I have seen students do it very well. I've also seen it kind of flop because um, you got to be careful not to make certain assumptions of your reader, if that makes sense. But I also have seen students write about religion in a more concrete way, not necessarily a biblical story, but I've read Joan of Arc as evidence and some other things like that. So I think you can. I teach in the South, and so I have had students try to use biblical evidence before. And if that is one of your go-tos, like if that is your wheelhouse, whether it's the Bible or the Quran, I've had a couple students actually like be very informed of like the Analects of Confucius and try to use that. So it really just depends on like your personal background. If that is something that you feel like you could write about knowledgeably and it makes sense for the prompt in your thesis, then go for it. I just don't reach for it. Like don't if you can't write about it knowledgeably, let's try to find a different example. And that goes for everything. Any recommendations on what I can use to drive my AP Lang academies? I have 20 hours to use. I'm not sure I understand the question. You have 20 hours to use. Could you, Veronica, could you just clarify for me what the AP Lang is that like you running like a class for your students? I don't think I'm understanding your question clearly, so I don't know that I can answer that. Oh, it's a Saturday prep. Oh, okay. It depends on what you've already done with them, but I would say that if they haven't done any type of mock exam yet, that would be something great to do. So my students, we have to break it up, but they have a timed multiple choice and synthesis essay in one sitting because that time they have a little bit longer to do it. And then the next time they come for a session, we do like the other 2 essays, like we do a rhetorical analysis and arguments. But anytime you can get students practicing writing a cold read, so something they haven't seen before in the right time. And I also think a mock exam can be helpful, even if it's just like 2 essays and not all 3, can be really helpful because it's something about like the pace. Like my students have always said, like coming out of the AP test, they're like, my hand hurts. Like, and that's just not AP Lang. Like that's all of them. But I feel like Lang is probably the most. History, they do have to write some. Biology, not so much. They do write, but it's not the same. But they're like, yeah, it's like this like stamina of like dealing with like the pressure and all that. So that would be something that if you had Saturday prep sessions, I would definitely try to simulate. And then of course, if you can build in time to go over it, that's always helpful. That's why I like the multiple choice test on AP Classroom is because they give you answer keys with like detailed explanations. And so as a teacher, I don't feel like the pressure to have to explain it all. But I think that really helps as well. So that's kind of like what we do. We unfortunately our school, we don't do it on Saturdays, but we do that kind of thing where anytime we have a study session, I try to think of like, what can I not accomplish in my classroom? And it's usually some sort of timed situation that's longer than 45 minutes. Awesome. So we've been on about an hour. For those who are like maybe new to this, my name is Coach Hall. I'm an AP Lang teacher from Arkansas, and I have a YouTube channel, and I also obviously have a TikTok. And so I have about 4 years of video content on YouTube and about 2 years of content on TikTok, where I try to help students and teachers prepare for the AP Lang exam. In addition to teaching my own students, I am a tutor online as well. So I'm happy to answer questions that people have about the exam. I've been trying to go live each Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern. So for me, it's 2 p.m. Central Time. And I'm going to be going live a few more times before the AP test. So in addition to these Sunday sessions, some weeks I'll try to also go live like later on a Sunday because that seems to work well. And I'm going to be doing some sessions on YouTube with Tim Freitas from the Garden of English. Our first one is March 20th at, I think it's 7 p.m. Eastern Time. So we've done these for a few years. We just kind of like start with one essay and we go through all of our tips for that. And then we do another essay typically at the next session. And we just kind of give all of our tips to help students as well. So make sure you're following on both platforms if you can. That way you don't miss those dates, but those are coming up soon. Let's see. You should check out High Five Wizard. It's an AP studying app. That's cool. It works with most classes. Let me write that down. So it's High Five Wizard. High Five Wizard. I'll have to check into that. So how does it work? Like, how does it help you study? Is it like for like pacing? Like, does it help you come up with like a schedule or something? That's really cool though. First of all, I'm impressed that your teacher made an app because that's really awesome. Could you tell me how many body paragraphs you suggest for a synthesis essay? 2 to 3 for body paragraphs. So 4 to 5 total. I feel like for synthesis, we tend to see more of the 3-paragraph essays for body paragraphs. But you could do 2. So worst case scenario, we're going to shoot for an intro and 2 body paragraphs. And if we run out of time, then hopefully we've proven our points well. Some students will do an intro, 2 bodies, and a conclusion, so 4 paragraphs total. And other students will do an intro and 3 bodies and get 4 paragraphs total. And then others will do an intro, 3 bodies, and a conclusion and get 5. The key is to make sure that you have your 3 sources and to really develop your ideas. So most of my students do either 2 or 3 body paragraphs. I feel like for synthesis, depending on the prompt, sometimes it's easier to do 2. And other times it's easier to do 3. Some students like to have their 3rd body paragraph be addressing the counter argument and maybe do like a counterclaim and rebuttal, and that's okay. Or it can be a 3rd main idea. The thing about the counter argument is because it's not required to address it, we want to make sure that we're not just like throwing it in there. A lot of my students who do it save it for their final body paragraph because if they don't get to it, they've already proven their point anyway, so it hopefully wouldn't affect their score. When I first started teaching AP Lang, I had a lot of students who would try to do it as their first body paragraph, and that worked for them, but they would sometimes struggle to finish their essays. So if you are trying to incorporate the counter argument, really think about where you want to put it. Is the conclusion necessary? No, it's not. It's not necessary on any of the 3 essays. Now, let me be clear, because some teachers really like students to write a conclusion. So I don't want to like contradict anybody's teacher. But based on the rubric, no, it's not mandatory. It's not required. I've read plenty of essays that were lacking a conclusion. So if you have time, yes, write one, especially if it's meaningful, especially if you're like digging into the broader context and not just summarizing your ideas. But if you don't have time for one, try to at least end your body paragraph that you're working on and just kind of end it in a way that wraps up your essay. Because honestly, in those cases, like I feel like I don't really notice that there's no conclusion. So a lot of times people just write a conclusion that like summarizes their main ideas, and like that might not be as effective. So no, it's not needed at all. But can you use it to possibly work towards sophistication and have these deeper ideas? Absolutely. Is that realistic for all students? No, not at all. Thank you for the likes on TikTok. Is Varsity Tutors a good website to practice with? I personally haven't worked with them. I've heard about them for like ACT and SAT, but I personally haven't looked at their stuff very closely to say. So I can't really vouch for them, but they've been around for a while. I can say that. I got a 4 on the exam and only did 2 bodies. Yes, like it is very possible to still score well. Remember that your exam too factors in like obviously all 3 essays and multiple choice, but yeah, you can score well with just 2 body paragraphs. Broader context. Okay, so they use this in the rubric and like language of the course sometimes. So broader context is going to be kind of like going beyond the issue. So for rhetorical analysis, in a conclusion, you might ask yourself something like, how is this message relevant today? So for instance, last year's prompt was Sonia Sotomayor, and it was about identity. So you could ask yourself like how, because the speech was from 2001. So we could ask ourselves like, how is this conversation of identity and what she said about her identity, how is that relevant today? Like, what is the conversation of identity like? Because she mentioned like the melting pot versus the salad bowl. Like 20 years later, have we embraced the salad bowl, or are we still struggling with that? And obviously, it's open to interpretation, and people's experiences and observations differ. But that would be broader context. Like, how is this message relevant today? If it's a very significant historical passage, one of the ones I teach in my class is FDR's speech after Pearl Harbor, when he basically asks Congress to declare war. So we know that the US did enter war, and they entered World War II. And a lot of my students have studied World War II in history class at some point. And so for their conclusions, they might talk about how historically we know that his speech was persuasive, because actually Congress voted in favor of war, and it was almost unanimous. The only person apparently who didn't vote yes was Jeannette Rankin, who was a lifelong pacifist, and she also voted against World War I. So kudos to her, I guess, for sticking up to her morals, for her morals. But yeah, it was basically a unanimous decision at that point to go to war. And so we know that. And so we could like kind of incorporate that in a conclusion and talk about like, yes, it was effective, and here's what happened. And that would be broader context as opposed to just like summarizing our main points. So that's kind of what I mean by that. It is harder to do, but it does help for like a more nuanced conclusion. Again, like not guaranteeing sophistication point or anything here, but it does kind of help make your essay go beyond what you've already said. Because I know when I was in high school, our teachers always told us to have like a thought-provoking ending, and then like never told us what that meant. And like I loved to write in high school, but I always found that really hard. Or they would tell us like, just say something new, like add something new. And then like and then I got to college, and our professors were like, why are you adding new things to your essay? Or I don't know. It was kind of like, it was weird advice. But so I try to be very concrete with my students about like what they should and shouldn't do. But I feel like writing in general is like very open, right? So yeah. Okay. To the person on TikTok, like, are you waiting for, or not TikTok, on YouTube, are you waiting for me to say goose? They keep putting duck in the comments. Any tips for writing about personal experience? Yes. So First of all, make sure it's a meaningful experience because a lot of times people write about like really superficial things. Also, remember that you need to be able to explain it to someone who doesn't know you. So we're not necessarily going for like sob stories or things like that, but we need to, it has to be something that you actually um, like dealt with and had some kind of impact on you. Maybe like you grew from it personally. That can be really helpful. So I do have a video on personal experience that gives some examples. So if you're looking for more info on that, just type in your search bar, like on online, Coach Hall rates personal experience or argument personal experience. But basically, we want it to be a meaningful experience. And so usually that means it's led to some kind of personal growth or you learned a lesson. Sometimes students will ask, like, can I make stuff up? And like, technically, yes, like they're not going to fact check you. But we want the story itself to be meaningful. So a lot of times we'll see students writing about like breakups and stuff. And sometimes those maybe don't come across the way the person intended. So that's something to consider as well. But you can write about like anything. I've had students write about some really good like sporting examples for personal experience. And it also depends on like what you're trying to connect it to as well. So some students might have like a real world example and then they might shift to a personal example and then they can acknowledge that. So they might say like, on a more personal note, like I have experienced this too, and then they like lead into it that way. And so if you're connecting like two different ideas in the same paragraph and you can transition well, that can be really helpful. And I try to talk about that in that video that I mentioned. But yes, you can absolutely write about personal experience. And some people, like there's one essay, it's like the Exploring the Unknown essay where the person wrote about personal experience in the intro, and it's kind of a unique intro because it's a delayed thesis. Like they kind of gave this anecdote. And so we were talking before about sophistication, and that's one that my students tend to use if they are like wanting to break free of like conventional writing. They'll try like an anecdote to lead into their thesis. And I have a couple students who do it quite well. I had a lot of students who are like, this is not my style of writing. Like, I just want to do a traditional way, and that's fine. But I have had a few students this year try to lead in with an anecdote of personal experience that was relevant and really use descriptive writing to try to go for that sophistication. So that's, if you're looking at writing about personal experience, you could also play around with the structure as well. All right. What other questions do we have? If you're finding this useful on TikTok, do me a favor and tap your screen a couple of times to give this some likes. Let's see. Any recommendations for writing your own piece that includes rhetoric? So do you mean like, are you having to write a speech or something for school? Like, are you having to write some kind of speech that you need rhetoric for? Yes. Okay. So what's your topic? Do you have a topic yet? So we're just waiting for, they might be typing. But the question was like, what can you do if you're writing your own piece? You're just planning right now. Okay. So it's going to probably depend on your topic. But remember, a lot of the choices that you study for rhetorical analysis, if you then have to give a speech, you can make some of those same choices. So first of all, we want to consider like what your topic is and like what your message is going to be or what your purpose is. Because if it's a class assignment, that might kind of change things because your audience would be like your teacher and your peers. But also you want to think about like choices, like, is repetition going to help you be more persuasive? Is it going to help if you're more logical? Like, should you be including facts or statistics to prove your point? Are you trying to appeal to emotion? If so, we want to really think about like your word choice and your detail. So it really kind of depends on what your goals are and what your topic is. But some of those choices that I mentioned could be particularly helpful. But yeah, that's how rhetorical analysis applies to the real world. I had a student a couple years ago. He was in FFA, which for those who don't know is kind of like an agricultural club. And he had to give a speech, and he came in and he won, which was awesome. And he came into school like after winning, and he was like, "I just want you to know I used AP Lang in my speech." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well, I was the only one who understood the rhetorical situation. I knew exactly who was on that panel and what their interests were. And so I tailored my speech to that. And I think that's why I won." And I was like, that's really cool. I've also had students tell me that like when they've had college interviews or job interviews too, they like tried to apply the, the rhetorical analysis skills they knew. I'm planning on taking AP Lang. Is it a difficult class? Good question. Okay, so here's like my honest answer is it really depends on what it's like at your school. Because I personally feel like my class is pretty easy. My students support this. But I also have my students for 10th and 11th grade year, so I can kind of ease into certain things with them. It is an AP class. So there are going to be things that are hard about it. But I would talk to people who are currently in the class and get their input and just make sure that they're like not, I don't want to say not biased, but just make sure that they're not being like weirdly emotional about it for some reason. Like maybe talk to more than one person and see if there's any kind of commonality there. I would also talk to your current teacher, because if that current teacher is not the AP teacher, they probably know who it is and they could probably tell you based on how you're performing in their class. Like what they recommend for you. But overall, I do think the class can be really helpful. I do think it can be helpful regardless of what you make on the exam. I think you can learn to be a stronger writer. And the skills that you learn in AP Lang are very helpful outside of just English because it's a lot of nonfiction. So if you're looking to prepare to be a stronger writer for college, maybe you want to go into law or medical stuff or business, this would be a class that would be, I think, very beneficial. Whereas, AP Lit, where you're looking at like poetry and short fiction, that might not be useful to you depending on what your future major is. So I do think the class is very helpful and it has a lot of useful skills, but depending on how difficult it is, that really depends on like your school's curriculum and that kind of thing. So definitely talk to your current teacher and talk to some people if you know them, if they're in the class. But like I don't think the class has to be difficult. Let me put it that way. And like as far as like my videos and stuff, that's part of why I do what I do. I try to break the topics down as clearly and concisely as I can. Sometimes it's a little bit tricky to do that via live. That's why I pre-record a lot of my videos. But if you do take AP Lang and you need some help, like please follow here, please follow on YouTube, because a lot of these concepts that maybe seem more difficult, we can break them down and make them easy. So don't like shy away from it just because it's an AP class. Thank you for the likes on TikTok. Oh, we reached 1K. I know that's probably like not a lot for some people, but anyway. All right. Any other questions about AP Lang? I will be going live next Sunday as well. And possibly like as the exam gets closer, going live a couple different times per week. I just, because I have two little ones, I can commit to this time each week, but and then the sessions that I'm doing with Tim Friedis on his YouTube channel, Garden of English. The first one's March 20th, and then we have 2 in April. And then 1 the night before the exam. And then after that one ends, I always go live on TikTok to answer more questions. Like I stay up super late the night before the exam because of people being in different time zones, and I try to answer a lot of questions that people have. So please make sure you're following on both platforms. That way you don't miss it. And if you do think of a question after we close today and you're like, oh, I wish I had asked this, or like, oh, she said this and I wanted to ask her what that meant. If you go to one of my recent videos and comment on it, then I can answer that. I can on TikTok, I can reply with a video. On YouTube, I can reply with just a comment if needed. But that way I can answer your questions as well. All right. So any other final questions? Thank y'all for joining. I'm glad it helped. Yeah, so let me know if there's any last minute questions, because I know a couple people just joined. So if you have an AP Lang question, just go ahead and type it in the chat. Do include all of the rhetorical situation in each evidence's commentary? That's a really good question. I don't think you have to, because like, I think that could be overkill really quickly, but you can kind of choose what you think is the most significant thing to mention. I have had some students kind of use it as a checklist though, and like it really did help their essays because they were kind of novice writers. And so it was kind of like, okay, well, they at least got it in there. Like I had one student who would use like space has like a checklist. Like she'd write it in the margin and she would like make sure that she talked about like all those different things in her commentary. And that was in 2020 and she made a 4 on her exam, which likely means that her essay scored a 140. And she's one like she is a student that will like have a special place in my heart because she was in my English 10 class. And at the halfway point of the year, I was like, hey, I really need you to go to honors. Like, that's where you're going to fit better. And she did not believe me. But she did it anyway. And then I was at the end of the year, I was like, hey, I really think you should take AP. And she didn't believe me, but she did it anyway. And she did phenomenally well on the exam. I was so proud of her. And then her senior year, she played soccer for me. And then when she graduated, she was like, by the way, like everybody thought I was really silly for taking AP. Nobody thought I could do it but you, and I did it, and I'm very grateful. So she just, whenever people ask questions like that about do I need to include all of the rhetorical situation, it kind of makes me smile because she did. Like she took every tip I gave in class super literally and would make checklists and would just go for it. But it worked for her. So yeah, you don't have to incorporate it for every piece of evidence. Be selective, but like holistically throughout your paper, it kind of helps to mention those things. Any advice on writing a research paper in AP Lang? It's kind of an argument and a synthesis. Yeah. Okay, great. Research papers can be tricky because it's like a synthesis, but you probably have to have more than what you would do for a synthesis. So just make sure that you are, number one, that you have a clear argument and clear main ideas. Work on integrating your evidence. So like little things like don't just drop quotes in there. You might already know this, but like try to embed them, and you can use the source's credentials. So you could say like, according to I don't know, like a 2017 survey, and then kind of do that, and then put your parenthetical citation at the end, or like, according to so-and-so, an expert on this, so use the sources to like work for you for a research paper. Try to create some sort of like conversation among your sources, meaning like in some of your paragraphs, because I'm not really sure how long your research paper is. Like if it's like a 5-page paper or something, you might have a lot more than like your typical 5-paragraph essay. So try to make sure that your sources are kind of working together, because a lot of times people tend to do like, here's my paragraph with one source, here's another paragraph with another source, and that can make it feel disjointed a little bit. Let's see. Fleur, did you have a question? 8 to 9 pages. That's a long, yeah. You're definitely gonna have more than 5 paragraphs. So you're gonna make sure that like those sources are kind of working together. Yeah, I have my students do a research paper too, in one of my classes because of synthesis. Because I try to also teach them APA. Because I did not know APA when I got to college, but I was an English major, so we did most things in MLA. But as an English teacher now, I'm like, okay, I need y'all to at least have a general idea of what MLA is and what APA is, because those are 2 formats. Now Google has templates, which makes it even easier. But that's one of the things that I try to make sure my students know, because most of my students go into something where they would need APA. I think I have one student who is an English major. I don't know if she's watching but Savvy. I made a comment like 2-3 weeks ago. I was like, I don't think any of my students have become an English major. And then one of my former students was on the live and she's like, actually, I am, which I should have known. She was an excellent student. But most of my students go into something other than English and they need APA. And so the research papers that you write for Lang and like synthesis essays are really helpful for that. How could I do better with rhetorical analysis? It's my biggest struggle right now. So that's a wonderful question. It kind of depends on where you think you're losing points. Like if it's your commentary, I would say we want to make sure that we're examining why the writer is making that choice, and thinking about why they're making that choice for that audience on that occasion. Because remember, speakers choose to structure their speech in a way that's going to get maximum impact. So we got to think about, okay, what is their desired message, argument, or purpose? Because that's going to be in your prompt. So if your prompt asks about message, Make sure both of your body paragraphs, or all three if you do three, make sure that you are connecting the choice that you're talking about to the message. I feel like students kind of leave that out a lot, or it's like super vague. Like if you just say, this helps the speaker convey their message, I could put that sentence in so many essays about so many different passages. So we want to say, okay, what the message is, and try to go beyond what the prompt says too. So always clarify what the message is. Even if you said it in your thesis, in your body paragraphs, clarify again. Try to rephrase it if you can. So that would be one thing, is make sure it's really clear why they're doing it. Keep asking yourself why. So that would be the biggest thing, is like try to have like 2 or 3 sentences of commentary for each piece of evidence. So why are they doing what they're doing? What's the impact, possible impact on the audience? How is it helping their message? And we could think about the rhetorical situation in a variety of ways too. So that would be my best advice for rhetorical analysis, is really push the commentary, which I know is the hardest part. So commentary is really difficult, but really asking yourself, okay, why are they doing this? And trying to be specific, because a lot of times we'll see commentary that's like, to emphasize their point. Okay, what's their point? Why are they emphasizing that point? Why does that point matter to the audience? I'm trying to like model for you what I do with my students a little bit. So try to avoid some of those like empty expressions, like opens the reader's eyes or paints a picture. Like if they're painting a picture, you're probably really trying to tell me about their word choice. So what words were painting a picture, and why do they need to paint that picture for the audience, and that kind of thing. So just keep asking yourself why. I know it sounds kind of cheesy, but I promise it actually really usually does help. Also, I have a ton of rhetorical analysis videos on YouTube, because that is my favorite one to teach. So if you type in like Coach Hall writes rhetorical analysis commentary, some stuff should pop up. I just posted a video on YouTube last night about sophistication, and a lot of those tips, even if you're not going for the sophistication point, a lot of those tips help with commentary. Because a lot of my students who apply those tips, even if they don't earn the sophistication point, they at least write better essays by trying to like do those tips. So definitely start there. If you haven't seen that video yet, or if you want sophistication tips or rhetorical analysis tips, please go give that video some love over on YouTube. And then if you type in like Coach Hall writes best rhetorical analysis tip, I have a video from, it was either this school year or last school year. I think it was maybe earlier this year, where I kind of go into how to write about the rhetorical situation. I think that one can be helpful as well. I think I linked it in my most recent video. So if you go to like my sophistication video and look at the description box, there's like some other videos that are helpful. I try to like link stuff so that people don't have to keep searching for things. Let's see. So I missed a question about, concessions in every paragraph. No, I don't think you have to. You can. You just don't want to you don't want it to seem gimmicky. So I feel like if you're going to do a concession and refutation, like just make sure it's actually helping your argument. Some people just tend to write like that though. So I don't want to say don't do it. Just make sure that you're not like forcing it, if that makes sense. Like if it's a reason that you're writing it, like if it's truly helping you, then great. But like if you're just trying to like concede every point for the sake of doing so, then maybe that's not the reason. So yeah, usually I see it like once in an essay for students, but it's not required. I do think people need to know how to do it though, because a concession, so basically if you don't know, a concession is like when you acknowledge the merit of the other side and then you still refute it. And I have used this technique in a lot of different meetings. So it is a very valuable skill. So it's kind of like saying like, oh yes, like that is absolutely true. However, we also need to consider this, or like, certainly one would think this and it's right in these situations, but we also need to consider this, or like, so it's kind of like a certainly, but, or a yes, but, or like, while it's true that. And so like that one is a very useful skill, like just to learn in your writing, but also you can use it in like real life situations. I promise I'm not an antagonist in meetings, but it does help to like be able to kind of know how to concede, because then people are less like put off by it, they're less offended, and then you're like, okay, let's focus on this instead. Whereas the counterclaim and rebuttal are really like clear cut, like they're really like, yeah, opponents think this, but here's why they're wrong. So like there's a time and a place for both. So I try to teach my students both, but I have them try to think about like what's going to come across better. My teacher deducts points for not having one in every paragraph. Okay, so I think it sounds like your teacher just wants you to be able to do it. Um, realistically, like, I don't know that you need to do that on the exam unless you think it's going to help your writing. I would say maybe try like your best one. But I do think it's a valuable skill. So I don't want to like tell you to go against your teacher's advice by any means. But like realistically, do we need to do that every time? No. But is your teacher probably trying to help you like develop your writing? Yes. So let's kind of see it as that. But like no, in future essays, you do not need one in every paragraph. What's the correct structure for your rhetorical analysis body paragraphs? Um, Here's the structure I teach. Claim, so like topic sentence. That's going to tell your main idea. And then evidence, commentary. We want more commentary than evidence. So I usually write like commentary times two for my students. Evidence, commentary, concluding sentence. So the purpose of your topic sentence is to tell your main idea. I do have some rhetorical analysis topic sentences that I give. There is a video on this too. It's like a couple weeks old on my channel. I'm sorry I'm like telling y'all like go to my channel. It's just that if you want to see examples of this, that's the best place for it. So hopefully I can give you tips here, but please don't think I'm like trying to avoid answering your questions. I'm just trying to be concise here and then give you other resources elsewhere. So check out Coach Hall Writes Rhetorical Analysis Sentence Frames. There is a pretty recent video on my channel about that. If you want to know how to construct a good topic sentence, if you want to know how to write some good commentary, I have some commentary sentence frames in there as well. These have really helped my students write some strong essays. So you're going to have your topic sentence that should convey your main idea. And then you want to have evidence, commentary, concluding sentence. The reason why I say evidence, commentary, I sometimes call those layers, is because if you just have one example, it's really not very convincing. So that's why I think you should have a couple pieces of evidence. And it can be like, let's say you're writing about a metaphor and there's only one metaphor. You can choose quotes from different parts of the metaphor, if that makes sense, and then kind of unpack it. So you could also talk about like, within the quote, you could analyze the word choice and the details within the quote that you chose. The concluding sentence is going to be to wrap up your paragraph. So don't try to preview your next main idea. The concluding sentence is kind of like the topic sentence, in that its job is to convey the main idea as well as just trying to wrap up the paragraph. So that's where you really want to try to tie it back to your thesis, because a good concluding sentence helps remind the person, hey, this is what I was proving. And I do have I don't know if I have a ton of like concluding sentence frames, but I do have a few in that video, I think. So that's the structure that I teach. If you also look up Coach Hall Writes How to Write a Rhetorical Analysis Body Paragraph, I do have a video where I show the process in a little bit more of an advanced way. But I have like a sample paragraph in there and I kind of break down, okay, this is what this sentence is doing and this is what this sentence is doing as well. For one of the prompts for Q3, it asked about what is your perspective on the philosophy of the security. Oh, yeah. I think, is this a former examined prompt? There was one. I don't know if this was on the exam or not, because there was one about, do you know who said the quote? Like, was there a quote in that prompt that you're mentioning? Because there's some really old AP like argument prompts that I don't use with my students, but they're pretty popular. So I'm curious if this is like an old exam prompt or if it's just something your teacher created. Because I think I know which prompt you're talking about, but I can't remember it exactly. It was something about like whether or not people want security or freedom or something like that. Honestly, COVID could be a good example for that. I feel like I've read a lot of like recent people writing more recent versions of the prompt and like their evidence was COVID, which we see a lot. Like, you got to just go with what you know. So yeah, I don't know off the top of my head without seeing the exact prompt and stuff. I don't know that I could think of anything. If it's about like security, but I would say maybe COVID could be an example depending on how you use it. Have you taught the pennies prompt or the wind turbine? I do the wind farm one. I do that with my sophomores because they do that one second. The first one they do is locavore because I have a unit on like man versus nature. Um, I like the penny prompt in theory, I just haven't taught it, because, like, I find it funny because, like, honestly, like, I could see both sides of it. Are pennies kinda useless? Yeah, but, like, on the same token, like, in our society, they can be sort of helpful. I've seen some decent essays about that, though, with, like, some good commentary, and I feel like it's a pretty, like, safe topic. So I'm gonna have to look at that one because I need to go do a more synthesis review for my own students before the exam. And I had saved a couple on AP Classroom, but I think that now that I remember the pennies prompt, I might go back and do that one. I've just seen really good essays on both sides of that prompt. All right, so I've been on for like over an hour and a half. So let's um let's ask our final questions, and I'll kind of wrap it up. Is the exam on computer or paper? It depends on what your school wanted. I would say most people are still on paper, but there are some schools that are doing computer. Um, at our school, we had a choice. So our AP coordinator asked us, and we were all like, paper. I asked my students, and they were like, is there a hybrid? I was like, no, because my students would love to type their essays because they type more quickly than they handwrite, but they do not want multiple choice on computer. So we ultimately decided that like paper like won out because they wanted multiple choice on paper. Um, but yeah, I think most schools around here are doing like I'm in Arkansas. I think most schools are doing paper. The only I think I only know one school around here that's doing digital. Um, but you could also do it by subject. Like some schools are it's kind of like one exam is paper and one is digital. I don't know, that might get really confusing, but I know a couple schools are doing it that way where like the teachers got to decide. My teacher said we should use one of the images provided in synthesis packet as a body paragraph. Um, well, yeah, you can definitely use so each synthesis prompt is going to have a visual text. And the benefit to those is that you don't really have to read much of anything. You just have to interpret. So it could be like a photograph, a comic strip, a bar graph. And so because of that, it can be very helpful to use that as a source because it kind of helps you save time. Also, depending on what the source is, they're pretty versatile. So a lot of times when there's like a chart or a graph, my students like to use those because it's very concrete data and it usually relates to another source as well. Sometimes the photographs are a little bit harder to use, but with a photograph, if you happen to get one of those, just kind of ask yourself, like, what is this picture showing? Because like with the wind farms one, they put it as like basically the first source. And if you just start flipping through, you might be like, what is this picture? But if you read the other sources and then go back to the picture, it might actually be helpful. So, like with the wind farm one, like you can see that it needs a lot of space. You can see how large the wind turbines are, which correlates with the need for space. You could see how many there are in the photo. And then, like, there's even mountains in the background. And one of the sources mentioned that it, like, blocks the surrounding landscape and it ruins the aesthetics. So if you ever get like a visual text as like source A or source B and you're not sure how to use it, skip it for a second, go read the other sources and then come back to it because usually you have more insight if you know how it fits into that conversation. Yeah, and the wind farms, I was feeling it was telling us that they maybe take up too much space. Yeah, they can. So, like, or at the very least, like, we need to consider the location because of the space. So that's something to consider as well. But I a lot of students when I give them that prompt, if I usually either walk them through it, like with my sophomores, I'm like, okay, what does this picture show us? And they can usually tell me. But like if I'm teaching it to one of my tutoring students as like, hey, we're practicing for the exam, I'm like, hey, if you see a visual text as source A or source B, then let's skip it and come back to it because you might not know what to say about it initially. So that's something I'm going to be reminding my own students of when we go back to synthesis. Okay, so I think I'm gonna like close out of live because I've been online for like almost an hour and like 30 or 40 minutes. But if you have additional questions, feel free to comment on a recent video or just join the live next week. It's gonna be at um, 3 p.m. Eastern time each Sunday, and I will be going live more frequently as well on YouTube and TikTok. So please make sure you're following on both platforms. But yeah, thank you all for asking such great questions. I hope it was helpful, and I hope to see you in a future live. So thank you and have a great day.